all hear me okay? Closer? Okay? All right. I like to move around. I won't be able to. All right. Well, many of you have been to Feast of Trumpets for 30, 40, 50 years or more. So what am I going to tell you about the Feast of Trumpets today you've never heard? That's tough to do something like that. The return of Jesus Christ. How many of you have thought more about the return of Jesus and world peace recently, more than you have in many, many years? I think a lot of us have. You know, I believe the disciples thought about the coming kingdom a lot, an awful lot. It was on their minds. You know, they very much disliked the Romans. And I think that's a nice word to say, dislike, on that term. They wanted to live alone in peace, like we do, especially, to say, I want to live in peace. And the more of the last few years, it's becoming more and more where I say, I want to live in peace. It's getting harder and harder to say, I want to live in peace. Would you turn with me to Matthew 24? And I'm going to start in verse 1. As you know, Matthew 24 talks about the return of Jesus. And in Matthew 24, verse 1, Jesus came out of the temple, and he was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. I'm not going to turn there, but in Mark 13:1, it says, as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. Just another way to say it. And then Matthew 24, verse 2, and he, Jesus, said to them, Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. In verse 3, in fact, the disciples and Jesus kept walking. They were among a bunch of people. They kept walking. In verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when will these things happen? And two things. The second question, what will be the sign of your coming? And actually the third question, and the end of the age. Now, when they asked this question, Jesus sat upon the Mount of Olives, probably returning to Bethany to rest. Now, the Mount of Olives directly faced the temple, and from there, Jesus could have a full view, even though he was some distance away from it. And then in verse 4, Jesus answered and said to them, See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying that I am Christ, and will mislead many. Now notice he didn't say a few of you are going to be tricked into something. He told the disciples, many of you are going to be misled. Now, you know, in my lifetime and even reading back, you know, there have been a few people I've read about and even seen on TV, a few people that have claimed that they were Christ, that they were Jesus, that have come back as the second coming of Christ. I personally have never ever met anybody that claimed that they were Christ. In fact, I've never even watched anybody on TV that claimed that they were Christ. I've heard about them, but I've never seen anybody that said that they were the Christ, that they were the second coming of Christ, and that was his second coming of Christ. I don't know if you've ever met anybody like that, but Jesus said there were going to be many people that say that they were the Christ. But the ones that he was talking about here, he's talking about something a little bit different. Now, there may, at the very, very end time, there may be a bunch of people coming back that say they are Christ, the Christ that came back. But right now, he's also talking about there are many, many people that are coming back that are saying they are the ones who are sent by God. They are the chosen ones sent by God with a special message sent by God, or have a new revelation sent by God, the chosen teachers. And they are the ones who are misleading many, many people right now, and have been ever since the time he said that to the disciples back then. In verse 6, we go on. You will be hearing of wars, rumors of wars. See to it that you are not frightened. That's very important for us to realize that. If war broke out tomorrow, would you be afraid? If we went to war with China tomorrow, would you be afraid? Jesus is telling us, don't be afraid. It's important for us to remember that, because he said those things must take place and the end is not yet. In verse 7, for nations will rise up against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms. In various places there will be famines and earthquakes. And in the rest of chapter 24 of Matthew's Gospel is filled with Jesus' prophecies and his predictions about the future. Now, I want to set the scene for you. The disciples are young men. Most of them are probably in their 20s, maybe early 30s. A couple may have been younger than that. They had been admiring Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. The temple was one of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient world that they had ever seen. It was already over 1,000 years old. It was built of white marble plated with gold, and some of the temple's supporting stones were 40 feet in length and weighed 100 tons. And you have, in fact, the cutting and moving of these massive stones, it remained a mystery of ancient engineering. And the disciples, who were uneducated Galilean fishermen, were looking at this, and they were in awe. They were awestruck by these huge and beautiful buildings. I probably still would be today if I was standing there looking at it. Wondering, how did they build this? How did they move these stones? And they were beautiful. And Jesus stood up and said, they're all going to be destroyed. The temple will be utterly destroyed. Not one stone will be left. And about 40 years later, in AD 70, Jesus' prediction came true. The Romans utterly destroyed Jerusalem. Now, some of Matthew 24's chapter, in the 24th chapter, verses 2 and 15 to 22, relates to those terrible events. But most of the rest of that chapter deals with the end of the age and the return of Jesus. But what about today? We've got all kinds of people saying, well, we can have world peace now if we just could follow God's laws. We could have world peace now if we just get along nation on nation on nation. We could go ahead and have world peace now if we could just learn how to get along with each other. Well, if any Christian believes that peace on earth will keep gradually increasing until we have kind of a golden age, that person hasn't read their Bible, especially chapter 24 of Matthew. The Bible predicts that things are going to get worse instead of better. Even though our technology is growing exponentially, the level of literacy is increasing worldwide, those trends don't create world peace. Have you ever thought, why not? Why can't we get along? Why can't we feed the world? Why can't we teach the world to read and get along? Why can't we do that? Well, there's a reason. Turn over with me to Genesis chapter 8. We're going to start in verse 20. Genesis chapter 8. This is the time of Noah. Genesis chapter 8. In verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered a burnt offerings on the altar. Now, before I go on, I want to just mention one thing very quickly. This is before Moses, before the law of Moses. And do you understand what he just said? He took of every clean animal and every clean bird. So the law of clean and unclean meats is there before Moses. And he also offered a burnt offering. So the law of burnt offerings is in place before Moses. So all of these things were there. All of these laws were in place before Moses. So if somebody tells you that these were the law of Moses, well, in that one verse, both of them were there way, way, way before Moses. Both of those kinds of laws were in place before Moses. Anyway, verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Verse 21. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. From the youth, man's heart is evil. And the Lord's told us that's why we can't get along. Man's heart is evil. The only world peace we have ever known has been the brief periods between wars when nations have paused to reload. Seriously, that's all we've ever seen. Plato said only dead men have seen an end to war. In Matthew 24, Jesus gave us a preview of what the world would look like just before the end time. He said these trends that are going to be are like birth pangs. As we consider these end signs of the end time, you might agree with me that they're like what we're beginning to see right now. I don't know if we're there, but we're seeing many of the signs that he talks about. In verse 5 and 11 of Matthew 24, he said many false messiahs and false prophets will be there to deceive many people. You know, if you turn on the television or the radio or you read on the internet, some of the false gospels that are being presented right now is you can hear people declare that it's God's aims to help you to get rich very easily. I mean, they just flat out say that's what the gospel is he wants you to become rich. You can hear many of them declaring that God's laws are done away with. They don't mince words about it. They just tell you his laws are done away with, freeing you to live any kind of life you want to live. Now, I believe that you're saved by grace and faith through Jesus Christ. I believe that. I don't believe that God has said that all of his laws are done away with and you can live any kind of life you want. They preach that you can live, once that you're saved, that you can live any kind of life you want, that law is totally done away with. And they do, and they preach that. You know, someone else on TV will guarantee to heal you, and almost always they will say, if you will send a healthy contribution to me on there. You know, false prophets, false gospels abound. Preachers may have a special message from God, and again, they almost always, in their broadcast, or spend maybe a third to a quarter of their broadcast asking for money out there, you know, is what it's about. In verses 6 and 7, Jesus predicted that there would be wars and rumors of war. In my lifetime, or short lifetime of my parents and grandparents, we've seen World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, the Soviet Union collapse, no peace. We've had the Gulf War. We've had rumors of war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Lebanon, Palestine. And now again, we've had rumors of war in North Korea, back to China, back to Russia. It's been never ending. Never ending. You know, that's in my grandparents in my lifetime, right here. Recently, USA Today reported that trafficking and mishandling of nuclear material has more than doubled in the past 10 years. And nuclear material is becoming a marketable commodity. Another prediction of Jesus, verse 7, was that there would be famines and earthquakes before the end of history. This is interesting. In the 1940s, there were 51 earthquakes measuring above 6.0 on the Richter scale. We go ahead 40 years to the 1980s. It went from 51 to 1,000 in 40 years. Now, in the 1990s, from 1990 to 1999, that number jumped from 1,000 to 1,500. And then from 2010 to 2019, that number jumped from 1,500 to 1,702. It's a little bit more, but not actually huge. But if we take that Richter scale and move it from 6 down to 5, because now they're much, much more accurate with that number jumps from 1,702 to 15,000 in that time period there. That's in 2010 to 2019, 9 years. It's 15,000 earthquakes. And I know they're not as dramatic from 5 to 6 on the Richter scale. But here's what's interesting. That was a 9-year period. The Richter scale was 5, and it went from, like I said, from 1,700 to 15,000. Do you know how many is on the Richter scale this year in 2020? Now it went from 9 years, it was 15,000. In the year 2020, so far this year, it's over 20,000 in less than a year. In the last 9 years, it was 15,000. So I guess what I'm telling you is not the same as it's been. Earthquakes are abounding on the earth. Now, can you say they are more accurate in measuring? I don't know. But I'm telling you, for 9 years they had 15,000. In less than a year, we now have 20,000. So, Jesus also predicted at the end time Christians would face much persecution. We know for a fact that Christians are being martyred in the 20th century more than many previous of the 19th centuries. A Methodist bishop in Indonesia reports his congregations have to post lookouts because Muslims will come in and they'll raid them and either beat them up or kill them in many places, and the police won't do anything about it. You know, you don't think of the United States and America being persecuted, but the ACLU is already dedicated to banishing religion from any of the public sector. We're seeing it all over the United States. They boo Christians in different places. They've tried to cut out any form of Christianity in all kinds of places. Another sign of the end time is an increase in wickedness. I just saw a statistic about Chicago. The murder rate in Chicago just a few weeks ago is double what it was all last year. You think wickedness is abounding? Look at the riots that have been going on all across the United States. Things are not as they have been. I don't care what the news is telling you. They're not what they have been. What could happen near the end time? Have you thought about that? What could happen in our country in the end time? I read a story, and I want to share it with you. I had to change a little bit of it. It's not quite like I read it. I wanted it to make it fit our group a little bit. But I think it fits some things that may happen for us. So I changed it a little bit, but I want you to use your imagination. And I hope you'll enjoy this story. I want you to imagine that due to a critical shortage of natural resources by the whole world, the United States in particular becomes the scene of a radical political upheaval. I don't think you'd have a hard time believing that in our country right now. Try to imagine that because of the very survival of the human race is severely threatened, it becomes necessary for the people of the United States to submit themselves to radical changes in our government. Is that hard to believe? We soon find ourselves living under a kind of dictatorship, with the government making all the decisions about allocation of resources, decisions about who shall have what food and how much, decisions about who shall live